My '98 Civic gave up the ghost just outside of Tonopah, Nevada, taking my last $200 and my plans for a fresh start with it. The desert sun had baked the hope right out of me, and by the time I limped into town, I was a man running on fumes and desperation. That's how you end up accepting a job at a place like the Clown Motel. The sign was the first warning, a grinning, 10-foot-tall clown with chipped paint and eyes that seemed to follow my broke-down shadow as I approached. The second warning was the old Tonopah Cemetery right across the road, a field of weathered headstones standing in silent judgment, a motel for clowns, neighboring a graveyard. It was either a cosmic joke or a very specific kind of hell. At that point, I couldn't afford to care which. Stones. The woman who hired me was Nora Croft. She wasn't what I expected. Instead of a bubbly, circus-type personality, Nora was a woman carved from desert rock and cigarette smoke, with eyes that had seen too many sunrises over those graves. "The job's yours if you want it," she'd said, her voice a gravelly whisper. "Night manager. Pay's not great, but the room's included. Just follow the rules." She led me into the lobby, and the air immediately grew thick and still. They were everywhere. On shelves, in glass cases, perched on chairs, hanging from the ceiling. Clowns. Hundreds of them. Life-sized jesters with ruffles and bells. Tiny porcelain harlequins with teardrops painted on their cheeks. And grinning, plastic monstrosities that belonged in a Stephen King novel. Nora said there were over 600. I believed her. It felt like 6,000. Their painted-on smiles were a silent, colorful jury, and their glassy, unblinking eyes watched me with a disturbing permanence. "They were my husband's," Nora explained, gesturing vaguely at the horde. "He thought it was a fun gimmick." She glanced out the window toward the cemetery. "Turns out they attract a specific clientele. The ones across the street are our quietest neighbors." She slid a single laminated sheet of paper across the dusty front desk. "Your responsibilities." I picked it up. It wasn't a list of duties like restock the vending machine or do the laundry. It was something else entirely. "Rules for the night shift. If you see a face in the window of room 12, do not look away until it is gone. The ice machine sometimes dispenses red. Do not use it. Do not touch it. It will stop on its own. Guests in room the 6th of May complain of children laughing. Move them immediately." And so on. I laughed. A dry, humorless sound. "Is this a prank for the new guy?" Nora's expression didn't change. "There are 7 rules, Leo. You break one, you endanger everyone. You break them all. Well, the last guy who tried is the reason I'm hiring." She tapped a long, nicotine-stained finger on the final rule. "At midnight, the front desk phone will ring. It will be a boy named Sammy Miller. He will ask, 'Has my father been buried yet?' You must lean close to the receiver and whisper, 'Not yet, Sammy. He's still waiting for you.' Do not say anything else. Hang up immediately." A cold dread, heavier than the desert heat, began to settle in my gut. This was insane. But the alternative was sleeping in the sand with the coyotes. I took the job. My first night was suffocatingly quiet. The hum of the ancient vending machine was the only sound, a low thrum against the crushing silence of the desert. The painted smiles of the clowns seemed to widen in the dim light, their shadows stretching into grotesque shapes on the walls. I kept glancing at the clock, my heart thudding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. 11:55, 11:58. At 11:59, the silence became a presence, a weight in the room. Then, exactly as the clock ticked over to 12 o'clock, the old rotary phone on the desk shrieked to life. The sound was a brittle, old-fashioned jangle that tore through the quiet and went straight up my spine. Puck. My hand trembled as I lifted the heavy, black receiver. Static hissed in my ear. Then, a voice. It was clear and thin like ice cracking over a deep lake. The voice of a child. Has my father been buried yet? The air left my lungs. It was real. All of it. I leaned forward, my lips almost touching the plastic, the laminated sheet rattling in my other hand. I could feel the glassy eyes of 600 clowns boring into my back. I took a shaky breath and whispered the words Nora had given me, the phrase that felt like a secret prayer and a terrible curse all at once. Not yet, Sammy. He's still waiting for you. There was a soft click, and the line went dead. I hung up the phone and stood there, trembling in the vast, echoing silence. The lobby felt colder, the smiles on the clowns more menacing. This wasn't just a weird job at a quirky motel. This was something else. The rules weren't a joke. They were a shield. And I was standing on the wrong side of it, with a long, dark night still ahead of me. You'd be surprised what a person can get used to. After a few days, even the nightly call from Sammy Miller started to feel like part of the job description, like taking out the trash or mopping the lobby. I'd answer, recite my line, and hang up, my heart doing a little jackhammer solo in my chest before settling back into its weary rhythm. I was learning to live with the fear, to file it away next to my mounting debt and my dead-end future. I told myself the rules were just Nora's way of managing a creepy old motel next to a graveyard, a bit of theatrical flair to keep the night manager on his toes. The clowns were still the worst part. During the day, they were just dusty relics, but at night, their painted smiles seemed to mock my attempts at normalcy. I'd be sweeping the floor and catch a glimpse of a porcelain face in my periphery, its expression seeming to have shifted from joy to malice. I was beginning to feel like the sole, underpaid guard in a museum of nightmares. One afternoon, while Nora was chain-smoking on the porch, I decided to push for more information. "The last guy," I started, trying to sound casual. "You said he's the reason you were hiring. What happened to him?" Nora took a long drag, her eyes fixed on the cemetery across the road. "Carl Jensen," she said, the name coming out with a plume of smoke. "Good worker, kept to himself, lasted almost 6 months, longer than most." She flicked her cigarette, sending a shower of ash onto the dry ground. "Then he got cocky, thought the rules were a game. He decided to test the first one." My blood ran cold. Rule number 1. If you see a face in the window of room 12, do not look away until it is gone. "He was doing his rounds," Nora continued, her voice dropping to that gravelly whisper I was coming to associate with the motel's darkest secrets. "Saw the face in the window of 12. He told me later, during one of his more lucid moments, that he just blinked. That's all it took, a single blink. He turned to run, but the door to the room was open. It's never supposed to be open." She paused, and the desert silence pressed in. "We found him the next morning in the lobby, tracing clown faces on the walls with his own blood, whispering about the one with the cracked smile." She finally looked at me, her gaze heavy and sharp. "He's in a state facility in Henderson now. The rules aren't a game, Leo, they're a contract. A fragile one. They keep things in a delicate balance. They keep our guests safe from them, and them safe from us." Her words hung in the air long after she went back inside, leaving me alone with the sun and the silent headstones. A contract. A balance. It sounded like something out of a folktale, but after Sammy's nightly call, I was starting to believe. That night, the belief was cemented in sheer, undiluted terror. It was almost 2 a.m. The motel was a tomb, no guests checked in, just me and the 600 silent jesters. I was doing my final walkthrough, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As I approached room 12, I could feel Nora's story crawling up my spine. The door was shut and locked, just as it should be. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and was about to turn away. Me half. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned my head slowly, my neck creaking in protest. There, pressed against the inside of the glass, was a face. It wasn't a reflection. It was pale and disembodied, like a smear of wet paint that had somehow gained 3-dimensional form. It was the face of a clown, its porcelain skin cracked and webbed with fine lines. One eye was a black, empty socket. The other stared right through me. A single, perfect blue tear was painted on its cheek, and its lips were stretched into a wide red rictus that was anything but happy. My instincts screamed at me to run, to bolt, to get as far away from that window as I could. But Nora's voice echoed in my head. He just blinked. So I stood there, frozen. I faced the thing in the window, my own reflection, a ghostly silhouette around its horrifying visage. My eyes started to burn, begging me to look away, to just close them for a second. The muscles in my back and neck screamed in protest. Time seemed to warp, stretching and thinning until each second was an eternity. The clown's grin seemed to widen, a silent, awful challenge. It knew what it was doing. It was waiting for me to fail. I don't know how long I stood there, 10 minutes, maybe an hour. Finally, as slowly as it had appeared, the face began to fade, dissolving back into the darkness of the room until nothing was left but the grimy glass and my own terrified, wide-eyed reflection. I collapsed against the opposite wall, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The contract was real, and I had just survived my first negotiation. For a week, an uneasy peace settled over the Clown Motel. My nights were a lonely vigil, punctuated only by Sammy Miller's ghostly question and the occasional passing trucker who was too tired or too strange to question the motel's decor. I'd survived the face in room 12, and the memory had branded itself onto my mind, a constant reminder to stick to the rules. I was beginning to think I could handle this bizarre purgatory. Then the Hayes family arrived, and I learned that some guests bring their own ghosts with them. A dust-caked minivan crunched into the gravel lot just as the sun was bleeding out across the horizon. A man, Robert, with the weary slump of a long-distance driver, came in first, followed by his wife Sarah, who looked just as drained. And between them, holding each of their hands, was their daughter. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, a small girl with wide, perceptive eyes named Sophie. They were just a family, tired and needing a place to rest. But as I processed their check-in, my gaze kept snagging on Sophie. She wasn't looking at me or her parents. Her attention was fixed on a dark corner of the lobby, where a marionette clown hung from a hook, its wooden limbs limp and its strings slack. Its painted smile was a permanent, chipped grimace. "He's sad," Sophie said, her voice quiet but clear. The adults ignored her, lost in the logistics of payment and room keys. "He says his strings are tangled." A shard of ice slid down my spine. I forced a smile. "Just an old toy, kiddo." She finally looked at me, and her eyes held an unnerving seriousness. "No, he's not. He's alive. He just can't move." Her father ruffled her hair. "Sophie, honey, stop it. You'll spook the man." He gave me an apologetic look. "Kids and their imaginations, right?" I just nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. I gave them the key to room 6, the only family suite we had available. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach as I watched them walk down the hall. Rule number 3 echoed in my mind. Guests in room the 6th of May complain of children laughing. Move them immediately. I prayed tonight would be an exception. The night wore on. I tried to lose myself in a tattered paperback, but my ears were tuned to the hallway, waiting for a sound I desperately didn't want to hear. At 12:30, a half hour after my chilling ritual with Sammy's ghost, the phone rang again. My hand shot out, expecting the familiar shriek, but this was a different, softer ring from an internal line. It was room 6. "Hello?" It was Robert Hayes, his voice tight with irritation. "Listen, I don't know what's going on next door, but can you tell them to keep it down? It sounds like there are a bunch of kids in there. They're laughing and running around. It's right inside the walls." The cold knot in my stomach tightened into a fist of pure fear. It was happening. "I'm very sorry about that, sir," I stammered, my voice sounding thin and distant to my own ears. "There are no other guests on your floor. Let me move you to a different room right away, on the other side of the building." 5 minutes later, I was helping a confused and annoyed family relocate their belongings. Robert grumbled about the inconvenience, but Sarah just looked spooked, clutching Sophie's hand tightly. Sophie herself was silent, but as they passed the front desk, she glanced back at me, her expression not one of fear, but of understanding. It was the most terrifying thing I had seen all night. Once they were settled, I was left alone with the silence and a terrible, gnawing curiosity. I knew I should leave it alone. I knew investigating was a spectacularly bad idea, but I had to know. I had to hear it for myself. Day. My feet carried me down the hall to room 6 as if they had a will of their own. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was cold and still. The beds were rumpled, a suitcase left open on the floor. It was a perfectly ordinary, messy motel room. Massa. I stood in the center of the room and listened. For a full minute, there was nothing. I almost convinced myself that Robert Hayes had imagined it, that the old building was just playing tricks on him. Then I heard it. It started faintly, a whisper of sound from within the wall right behind the headboard. It was the sound of a child's giggle, distant and innocent. It was so light, so joyful, it almost sounded beautiful. Another giggle joined it, then another, a small chorus of disembodied, happy laughter. It was exactly as the rule described. Ispas. I should have left then, but I was mesmerized. The laughter grew louder, closer, as if the children were running down a long corridor inside the wall, coming right toward me. The joyful sound began to change, the edges fraying. The giggles sharpened, twisting into something else. The innocence curdled into a high-pitched, mocking sneer. It wasn't the sound of children playing anymore. It was the sound of something cruel and ancient pretending to be children. It was coming from every direction now. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, a cacophony of menacing, cold glee that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. I scrambled backward, fumbling for the doorknob, and slammed the door shut behind me, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I didn't just hear them, I felt them. The children in the walls were real, and I had just let a family sleep right next to their playground. The laughter from room 6 haunted the quiet hours of my shift, long after I'd fled back to the relative safety of the lobby. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams were filled with the sound of children's giggles twisting into something sharp and predatory. I spent the next day in a fog of anxiety, watching the Hayes family's minivan in the lot like it was a ticking bomb. Every time I saw little Sophie, her wide, knowing eyes seemed to follow me. A silent accusation that I knew more than I was letting on. She was right. The supernatural fabric of the motel, already stretched thin, began to tear. The escalation started with small, impossible things. Thirsty and on edge, I fed my last dollar into the ancient vending machine for a coffee. I watched the metal coil for my chosen row turn, heard the familiar thump as a product dropped, but when I reached into the slot, my fingers met nothing but cold, empty air. The machine had taken my money and delivered a phantom. It was a petty, bizarre violation of reality. A ghost in the machine that left me feeling more unmoored than ever. Later, the ice machine by the lobby entrance suddenly sputtered to life, churning with a sickly, grinding noise. I remembered rule number 2 with a jolt of panic. The ice machine sometimes dispenses red. I approached it cautiously. From the chute, a thick crimson liquid began to ooze out, not like water, but viscous, like syrup. It dripped onto the worn linoleum in a slowly spreading puddle that smelled of rust and something else, something faintly, horribly organic. I backed away slowly, my stomach churning. The rules weren't just warnings, they were a catalog of symptoms for a sickness that was spreading through the building's very bones. The true crisis came just after midnight, right after my nightly whispered conversation with Sammy's ghost. A floorboard creaked on the second floor. It was a soft sound, easily mistaken for the settling of an old building, but my nerves were stretched so taut that it sounded like a gunshot. I hurried to the small, grainy security monitor behind the desk. On the screen, a small figure was moving down the empty hallway. Kofi. It was Sophie. I found her on the second-floor landing, a tiny silhouette in her pink pajamas, her bare feet silent on the grimy carpet. She was standing perfectly still, her head tilted as if listening to a secret only she could hear. "Sophie?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. She turned to me, but her eyes were unfocused, glassy. "They were calling to me," she said, her voice distant and dreamy. "The children in the walls. They said it's almost time to play. They're getting tired of their old games." A cold that had nothing to do with the desert night sank deep into my bones. I gently took her arm, which felt icy to the touch, and led her back to her room. Her parents, thankfully, were sound asleep. I tucked her back into bed and retreated, my mind reeling. She wasn't just sensitive to this place, she was a beacon, and the things here were drawn to her light. When I got back to the lobby, the air had changed. The temperature had plummeted, and the painted smiles of the clowns on the shelves seemed to glitter with a fresh, hungry malice. I felt a pressure in my ears, the kind you feel before a storm hits. I wasn't alone. He was standing in the middle of the room, right by the sad-looking marionette Sophie had pointed out. A small boy, no older than her, dressed in old-fashioned button-up pajamas. He wasn't transparent or shimmering. He looked solid, real, as if he'd just walked out of one of the rooms. But his skin was deathly pale, and his eyes were dark, hollow pits that seemed to absorb the light. This wasn't Sammy Miller. This was someone new. He looked right at me, and his voice, when it came, was not a whisper or an echo. It was a clear, cold statement of fact. "She can hear us," he said, his gaze unwavering. "She hears us better than anyone ever has." I was paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to move. "We're getting stronger now," the boy continued, taking a step closer. The clowns on the shelves seemed to lean forward, a silent, attentive audience. "And we've chosen her. She's going to be our friend, forever." Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The air rushed back into the room, the oppressive cold lifting slightly. I was left standing there, my body trembling, the boy's words echoing in the sudden, terrible silence. This was no longer about managing a haunted motel or following a set of bizarre rules. This was about a little girl. The spirits weren't just playing games anymore. They were recruiting. The game had changed, and I was beginning to realize it was one we were all destined to lose. My hand was shaking so badly it took 3 tries to dial Nora's number. The encounter with the boy in the lobby had shattered the last of my denial. This wasn't a haunting. It was an infestation. And it was getting organized. The phone rang once, twice before she picked up, her voice a familiar, gravelly rasp. "What is it, Leo?" She sounded tired, as if she already knew. The words tumbled out of me in a frantic, whispered rush. Sophie sleepwalking, the phantom coffee, the bleeding ice machine, and finally, the pale, solid boy with the hollow eyes and his chilling declaration. "He said they've chosen her, Nora. He said they're getting stronger." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, filled only by the hum of static. When she finally spoke, it was with a profound weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep. "Meet me on the porch." The night air was cold, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had taken root in my soul. Nora was already there, a dark silhouette in a rocking chair, a fresh cigarette glowing in her hand. She didn't look at me, her gaze fixed on the moonlit headstones across the road. "My husband, David, he bought this place 40 years ago," she began, her voice low. "Thought the clown theme was clever, a roadside gimmick to pull people in." She took a slow drag. He didn't know about the town's history, not really. The fires, the mine collapses, Tonopah is built on 1,000 forgotten tragedies. A lot of them were children. Lost, lonely spirits with no one to remember them. She pointed the glowing tip of her cigarette towards the lobby, where the glass eyes of the clown collection glinted in the dark. He filled this place with symbols of childhood. Happy, smiling faces. He thought he was building a motel. What he really built was a beacon. The pieces started to click into place, forming a picture more horrifying than I could have imagined. The spirits? They were drawn here? "Like moths to a flame," she confirmed. "At first it was small things. A whisper, a cold spot. Then it grew. I started seeing them, hearing them. They weren't malicious, just lonely. They wanted to be noticed. After David died, it got worse. They needed an anchor. Her voice cracked, just for a second. So I made a deal with them. I stared at her, the laminated sheet of rules flashing in my mind. It wasn't a safety checklist. It was a treaty. I gave them a place to stay, Nora whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert wind. I let them have their little games. The phone call from Sammy, the face in the window, the laughter in the walls. Minor hauntings. In exchange, they agreed to a simple term. They would never, ever harm a guest. They would leave the living alone. The rules were the terms of our contract, a way to keep the balance. But Sophie changed everything, Nora finished for me, her voice grim. She's not just a guest. She's a psychic amplifier. Her presence is giving them a power they've never had before. It's feeding them, waking up their ambition. They don't just want to be noticed anymore, Leo. They want a friend. They want her. The full weight of our situation crashed down on me. We weren't just dealing with ghosts. We were dealing with broken promises and hungry spirits. The next morning, a frantic Robert Hayes was at the front desk before the sun had fully risen. "We're leaving," he announced, his face pale and drawn. "I don't care what it costs." My daughter was talking in her sleep all night about a forever sleepover, but the spirits had already made their move. 15 minutes later, he was back, his face a mask of disbelief and rising panic. "The car won't start. It's completely dead. Not just the battery, everything. The electronics are fried." I grabbed the motel's landline to call the only mechanic in town. The line was dead. No dial tone, just an empty, hollow silence. I pulled out my cell phone. No signal, not a single bar. It was as if we were in a bubble, completely cut off from the outside world. Sarah and Sophie joined Robert at the entrance, their faces etched with confusion and fear. They all stood there, looking out at the silent, dusty road that led to nowhere. The vast, open desert that had promised freedom now felt like the wall of a prison. The Clown Motel was no longer a stopover. It was a cage, and the children had just locked the door. Panic is a corrosive acid. It ate away at Robert Hayes's composure first, turning his frustration into raw, directionless anger. He paced the lobby, shouting into a dead cell phone, while Sarah tried to comfort a strangely placid Sophie. Nora and I could only watch, trapped in the knowledge that no mechanic was coming, no tow truck would arrive. The ghosts had drawn a line around the Clown Motel, and we were all caught inside. Desperation clawed at me. The rules had been our only shield, but they were designed for containment, not confrontation. To find an answer, I had to break one. There was one place in the motel that Nora had declared was off-limits, a place not even mentioned on the laminated sheet, the basement. "There's nothing down there but dust and circuit breakers," she'd told me when I first started, her tone leaving no room for argument. It was a lie. I could feel it. While Nora tried to calm the Hayes family with a false promise of a phone line that would surely be fixed by afternoon, I slipped away. The door to the basement was tucked away in a cramped utility closet, secured with a heavy, rusted padlock. It felt cold to the touch. I found a crowbar in the maintenance cart, and with a guilty metallic screech that echoed in the silence, I broke the lock. I was violating the one unspoken rule, and I knew it. A wave of stale, cold air washed over me as I pulled the door open, carrying the scent of damp earth and something cloyingly sweet, like old potpourri and decay. I flicked on my phone's flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous path down a set of rickety wooden stairs. Purrie. The basement wasn't just for storage, it was a sanctuary, their sanctuary. My light swept across a scene so bizarre and horrifying it stole the breath from my lungs. The concrete floor was arranged with a dozen small, immaculately made beds. They were old-fashioned, with wrought iron frames painted a cheerful white, each covered with a handmade quilt. At the foot of each bed was a small wooden chest, like a child's toy box. It was a dormitory for the dead, a dozen little beds for a dozen little ghosts. And in the very center of the circle there was a new one. Bahule Urla Injan Mahan Namtuba Fakha. This bed was pristine, the white paint on its frame still bright. The quilt was a patchwork of pinks and purples, and at its center, embroidered with neat cursive stitching, was a single name, Sophie. They had been preparing for her. They weren't just recruiting a new friend, they were welcoming her home. A floorboard creaked above me. I snapped my light off, my heart hammering against my ribs, and scrambled back up the stairs, pulling the broken door shut behind me. I stumbled back into the lobby, my mind reeling, my hands shaking. I had to tell Nora. I had to tell the Hayes family. We had to get Sophie out. But as I stepped out of the utility closet, my blood ran cold. The lobby was empty, except for a single, small figure standing by the front desk. It was Sophie, or it looked like her. Yes. She was bathed in an eerie, pale light that didn't seem to come from any of the windows or lamps. Her movements were fluid and graceful, but also strangely disconnected, like a puppet on a string. The marionette in the corner, I noticed, was now looking directly at her, its head tilted in a mimicry of her own. "Leo," she chirped, her voice a sing-song imitation of her own, yet overlaid with a chorus of faint whispering echoes. She smiled, a wide beatific smile that didn't reach her vacant eyes. "Isn't it wonderful? They've made a bed just for me." My voice was trapped in my throat. This wasn't Sophie. Not the real her. This was a projection, a spiritual puppet. "We're going to have a forever sleepover," she continued, pirouetting slowly in the center of the lobby. "We can be in two places at once now. I can be here with you, and I can be with them. Soon I won't need my old bed upstairs at all." She giggled, and this time it was the sound I'd heard in the walls of room 6, a chorus of high-pitched menacing glee pouring from the mouth of a 7-year-old girl. The children weren't just getting stronger, they were evolving. They had tethered themselves to Sophie, using her as a bridge, an anchor that allowed them to project their consciousness, to exist in the waking world in a way they never could before. They were wearing her soul like a costume. The forever sleepover had already begun. The spectral puppet show in the lobby ended as abruptly as it began. The projection of Sophie flickered and vanished, leaving behind only the oppressive silence and the faint, sweet smell of decay wafting up from the basement. I rushed to find Nora, my words a frantic jumble as I described the circle of beds, the one with Sophie's name, the horrifying puppet she had become. For the first time since I'd met her, Nora's stony composure crumbled, replaced by a raw, naked fear. "They broke the deal," she whispered, her face pale beneath its weathered lines. "The contract is void." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. The balance she had maintained for years was gone. The spirits, drunk on the power Sophie provided them, had abandoned the pretense of their old games. The rules were no longer a shield. They were a pile of broken promises. The rest of the day was a slow, agonizing crawl toward midnight. The Hayes family, now gripped by a palpable terror, huddled in their new room. The dead car and silent phones a constant reminder of their imprisonment. Nora and I could offer them no comfort, only the grim reality of our shared cage. We were just waiting for the clock to strike 12, for the other shoe to drop. And when it did, it wasn't a shoe. It was an avalanche. The first sign that everything had changed came at 11:59. A low hum started to build, vibrating through the floorboards, making the glass in the clown cabinets rattle. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a deep, resonant frequency that settled in my teeth and bones. Then, at precisely midnight, the old rotary phone on the desk shrieked. I reached for it on instinct, my hand trembling, my mind clinging to the familiar ritual. But this time Nora put her hand on my arm, stopping me. "Wait," she breathed, her eyes wide with dread. "It's not him." The phone rang again, a frantic, demanding peal that was sharper and more aggressive than Sammy's usual call. On the third ring, I snatched the receiver, my ear buzzing from the hum. A line was crystal clear. The static was gone. And it wasn't Sammy's thin, lonely voice that spoke. It was a chorus of voices, the high-pitched, gleeful whispers of the children from room 6, all speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. "The new girl is so much fun," they chimed. "Do you want to come play with us too?" My blood turned to ice. My mind raced, fumbling for the correct response, the familiar words that had always kept the darkness at bay. But the question was wrong. My script was useless. Sammy Miller, the lonely ghost boy who had been the linchpin of our nightly ritual, was gone. They had taken over his line. They had rewritten the rules of the game. "Bellevue, who is this?" I stammered, my voice a pathetic croak. The laughter that answered me was a symphony of malice. "Wrong answer," they sang, and then all hell broke loose. The first sound was a high-pitched crack, followed by an explosive shatter. The large plate glass window of the lobby spiderwebbed and then imploded, showering the room with glittering shards. A freezing wind howled through the opening, carrying the smell of freshly turned earth. One by one, the windows on the first and second floors blew out in a cascade of shattering glass. Clang, 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 clang. The motel room doors, all of them, slammed shut with impossible force, the sound of their deadbolts shooting home echoing like gunshots down the empty halls. We were locked in. Nora grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back of the lobby, away from the flying glass. Her eyes were fixed on the world outside, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. "Leo, look!" I followed her gaze, past the jagged hole where the window used to be, across the dark road to the Tonopah Cemetery. The headstones were moving. Not shaking or trembling, they were physically moving, scraping through the dry dirt, sliding from their plots like ancient gray teeth erupting from the ground. They were lumbering, impossibly, toward the motel. The foundation of the building groaned in protest as a chorus of ghostly wails rose from the cemetery, a sound of pure, liberated hunger. The spirits were no longer bound by their promise or their lonely patch of ground. They had declared their contract void, and they were coming to collect their prize. Trapped, out of time and out of options, Nora looked at me, her eyes reflecting the chaos. "There's only one place we can face them," she said, her voice grim but resolute. "Their place of power, the place where it all started." I knew where she meant. The place I was never supposed to go, the basement. The world outside was a nightmare of sound and motion. The scraping of headstones, the howling wind, and the triumphant wails of the unbound dead formed a symphony of chaos. Inside, the Clown Motel had become a pressure cooker of spiritual energy. The painted smiles of the clowns seemed to warp and sneer in the flickering lights, their glass eyes glowing with reflected malevolence. Every rule was broken, every safeguard shattered. Nora grabbed a heavy mag-light flashlight from behind the desk, her movements now sharp and decisive. "They're anchored to this place," she yelled over the cacophony. "But Sophie is their bridge. If we can break their connection to her, we might have a chance." We navigated the debris-strewn lobby and wrenched open the utility closet door. The padlock I had broken lay on the floor like a discarded shackle. The air that billowed up from the basement was no longer just cold. It was arctic, heavy with the power of the coalesced spirits. We descended the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting a frantic path through the oppressive darkness. The scene in the basement was even more terrifying than before. The circle of small beds glowed with a faint, ethereal light. In the center, on the bed embroidered with her name, lay the real Sophie Hayes. She was pale and still, her chest barely rising with each shallow breath. Her life force was being siphoned away, a visible silver mist rising from her and swirling into the air, feeding the spectral energy in the room. And standing around her bed were the children. There were 3 of them now, fully materialized and solid in the gloom. The pale boy from the lobby stood beside 2 girls, one with dark braided hair and a tattered dress, the other smaller, with wide, frightened eyes that held no fear at all, only a hungry void. They were no longer just lonely echoes. They were entities, radiating a palpable aura of ancient longing and newfound power. Lily, Ben, and Alice. Their names seemed to whisper into my mind. "You're too late," the boy, Ben, said, his voice, the clear, cold tone of the chorus on the phone. "She's almost one of us." The girl with the braids, Lily, smiled. It was a sharp, predatory expression. "She's our key. With her, we don't have to stay in this dusty old place. We can go anywhere, see anything. We can spread out, find more friends, all across the country." My mind recoiled at the thought. A psychic plague unleashed from a forgotten Nevada motel, spreading through the lonely and the lost, carried by a little girl's stolen soul. "Let her go," Nora pleaded, her voice cracking. "Take me instead. I made the deal with you. It's my responsibility." Alice, the smallest girl, giggled, the same chilling sound from the walls. "Your energy is old, bitter. Hers is bright and new. We like it more." Desperation is its own kind of power. As I looked at Sophie, so small and fragile, an idea took root in my mind, a wild, insane, and utterly final bargain. I had nothing. No money, no future, no one waiting for me. I was a ghost in my own life long before I came to Tonopah. Maybe that's what they really needed. Not an amplifier, but an anchor. Not a battery, but a willing host. "You don't have to take her," I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the noise. The three children turned their hollow eyes on me. "You want a connection to the living world. You want a friend who understands being lost." "That's me." Ben tilted his head. "You would give yourself to us." "A new deal," I said, taking a step forward, my heart pounding a frantic final rhythm. "Let the Hayes family go. Let them walk out of here, car running, phones working. Let them forget this ever happened. In exchange, I'll stay. I'll be your anchor. I'll be your willing connection. You won't have to steal it from a child. I will give it to you." The three spirits looked at each other, a silent, lightning-fast communication passing between them. Lily's sharp smile softened into something more curious. Ben's cold expression shifted to one of calculation. "He is lonely," Alice whispered, her voice filled with a strange wonder. "Like us," Lily turned back to me. "You would give up your life for them?" I looked at Sophie, then at Nora, whose face was a storm of disbelief and horror. "I don't have much of a life to give," I said, and for the first time it felt like the honest truth. "Let them go. I'm yours." Ben nodded once. "We accept." A wave of energy, cold and immense, slammed into me. It felt like diving into a frozen ocean. My vision blurred, and the sounds of the chaotic night faded into a distant roar. I felt my life force, my humanity, being drawn out. Not drained away like Sophie's, but intertwined, braided together with theirs. I was becoming something else. Not living, not dead, but a bridge between. As the last of my old self slipped away, I saw the silver mist around Sophie recede, her breathing deepen. The lights in the clown's eyes upstairs flickered and died. The scraping from the cemetery ceased. The deal was done. In the aftermath, the world settled into a new kind of quiet. The Hayes family awoke in their beds with no memory of the terror, only a vague feeling of a bad dream. Their car started, their phones worked, and they drove away from the clown motel without a backward glance. Well, but I remained. I am the night manager. I am the anchor. I am the children's guide. They are still here, but their hunger is gone, replaced by the stability I provide. We are learning together. I have become their teacher, and they are my students. I am teaching them how to use their abilities not to terrorize, but to connect. We reach out, sometimes, offering a whisper of comfort to a lonely traveler, a fleeting memory of a loved one to a grieving soul who stops for the night. The Clown Motel is no longer a place of horror. It is a training ground, a strange and permanent home where we are learning a new, more compassionate form of haunting. I am Leo Vance, and this is my forever sleepover.